Hello, good morning. This is Sky News Breakfast, live from both sides of the Poland-Ukraine border as the humanitarian crisis from the Russian invasion grows.
Western Ukraine. From here, tens of thousands of people have boarded trains to flee this country.
And they are coming to places like this, Krychenko in Poland, when they arrive as refugees looking for sanctuary. A seventh night of violence in Ukraine, with latest reports suggesting 21 people have been killed and more than 100 injured in shelling in the eastern city of Kharkiv. President Biden praises the bravery of Ukrainians and unity of the West in the face of Vladimir Putin's invasion.
When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos. They keep moving.
Ukraine's President Zelensky remains in the capital, Kiev, telling reporters he's not seen his family for several days while he defends his country. Edging slowly closer, a huge convoy of Russian armoured vehicles is now just 18 miles from the centre of Kiev. The Ukrainian sports stars, including the world heavyweight boxing champion, take up arms to defend their country. Hello, good morning. We're live in Krychenko in Poland. This is one of the 8 border crossing points with Ukraine. And over the past week or so, this country has seen 450,000 people forced from their homes in Ukraine, seeking safety here as refugees from the Russian invasion. Overnight, President Biden to say that Vladimir Putin must pay a price for his onslaught on Ukraine as he closed US airspace to Russian aircraft. Well, let's take you through the latest developments. And in the last hour, a Ukrainian official has said that at least 21 people in Kharkiv have been killed in shelling in the last 24 hours. Another 112 people were reportedly wounded. Late last night in Zhytomyr, a city about 85 miles west of Kiev, 4 people were killed when a cruise missile hit their homes. Ukrainian forces still hold the cities of Kharkiv, Kherson and Mariupol. But local Ukrainian media reports that Mariupol's mayor says Russian forces captured the city's railway station and port last night. Well, the huge Russian convoy of tanks and armour is now within 20 miles of the city centre of Kiev, but has not made significant progress since yesterday.
The aftermath of a Russian cruise missile strike in Zhytomyr, a city 85 miles west of Kiev. And these are residential buildings near a hospital. Guys, there's a man in this house. Be careful, the firefighter shouts. Ukraine's 95th Air Assault Brigade are based in Zhytomyr. The Russians were likely aiming at them. An Interior Ministry official says 4 people were killed. Ukraine's wartime president, unshaven and tired-looking, as he spoke to reporters.
Because I have work and sleep, that's it.
Can you see your family? Can you see your kids?
No, I can't.
When was the last time you saw them?
Before this war.
Thank you.
I mean, just one last question. You may have already answered
No,
it.
not before this war. No, 3 days ago. The middle part of this war. Yeah.
Then the news that what the Russians had billed as a precision strike on Ukrainian communication networks, right by the Kiev TV tower, has hit the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Site too.
Babi Yar now it's bombing.
Babi Yar?
Yes.
The memorial?
Yes, the memorial which
that we made
they started building after 80 years of this tragedy. It's second Babi Yar.
That is Russia. My congratulations.
Thank you. Guys, thank you.
Все остаются здесь, я сейчас заберу.
Russia is picking up the tempo of its war on its next-door neighbour. 11 people were killed and apartment buildings ripped to shreds in the eastern city of Kharkiv after a barrage of artillery strikes on Tuesday, including this strike on the main government building in Kharkiv's Freedom Square early in the morning. This is a maternity ward in the southern city of Kherson, forced to relocate to a bomb shelter because the sick and those about to give birth just can't leave alongside the 500,000 who already have. Ukraine's health minister posted this picture on his Facebook page of a health worker he says was shot dead by Russian forces as she drove her injured nephew to hospital in Kiev. To the north of the city, the 40-mile-long armoured convoy bearing down seems to have stalled. A US official says it may have logistical issues or fuel shortages. But Kiev waits for the storm that is to come, 1 week into this war that Russia's president swore he would never wage.
And we can talk to Diana in Moscow now. And Diana, has there been any response from President Putin to the latest comments we've had from America overnight?
No, not yet. He doesn't tend to start talking early. But we can expect some response from the Kremlin spokesman when he has his daily call. And I expect them to be typically pugnacious and belligerent, because I think that is the mood that Vladimir Putin is in now. As far as more developments overnight in Ukraine go, we understand that Russian paratroopers have been having an extensive gun battle in Kharkiv around the military hospital there, but no loss of life amongst the Ukrainian military. But we do understand that 21 have been killed in Kharkiv over the last few days. And as we saw in that report, not much movement of the convoy, which is approaching to Kiev, and a fairly quiet night in the capital. But if you think about the fact that Vladimir Putin has bombed in his first strikes in the center of Kiev the cemetery of Babyn Yar, which is a Holocaust memorial to the tens of thousands who were killed by the Nazis during World War II, and that Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish and that his family members were killed by the Nazis. And Vladimir Putin calls this a denazification program, essentially, in Ukraine. It just beggars belief, the justification that he is trying to sell to his own people about this. Because what we're seeing in Ukraine is a terrible war. And what we're beginning to experience here is an economic war that is going to be incredibly long-lasting, longer lasting than the conflict in Ukraine, which Joe Biden said last night would probably end up lasting quite a long time in itself. But here we're already seeing a lot of people leaving. One businessman said to me, Vladimir Putin has undone the work of the last 20 years. And if you look back at the 90s, at least we had something to hope for, and now we don't. A lot of people saying things like, who would want to live in North Korea? But that's the people who understand the impact of the economic sanctions and what they will mean for the future of the Russian people. But a lot of people don't, because they listen to the state's propaganda and they don't understand what is happening in Ukraine.
OK, Diana, thanks so much for that. Well, let's look at the latest now assessment from the UK Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who joins me now. Mr Wallace, what power do you think the West has to stop what President Putin is doing without starting World War III?
Well, we can help support, which we have done, and the United Kingdom has been in the lead, the ability for Ukrainian armed forces and indeed the whole population to defend itself. That's why we have equipped, actually from a British point of view, for some months the Ukrainians with anti-tank missiles and other weapons systems and non-lethal aid. And that's why last Friday, I hosted a donor conference of nearly 30 countries from NATO and non-NATO to try and collect up as much lethal aid and non-lethal as possible to make sure they can do that. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, as you've seen across the international community, very, very strong raft of sanctions. You know, we have seen sanctions that I haven't seen before. The Russian Central Bank has been sanctioned. A number of Russian banks with their assets have been frozen. You know, that is going to cost the Russian government and the Kremlin a lot, and it's going to reflect into the economy of Russia almost immediately. I think we saw 20-30% of the ruble's value drop. We saw interest rates nearly double. So the international community has shown how very angry it is with what's going on in Ukraine, both economically and from many of us in Europe, the sort of military point of view. And I think, you know, those two things are one of the reasons why we see the Russian armed forces moving very slowly on its objectives. It is behind schedule considerably. And while we've seen some footage today in Kharkov of Russian forces potentially in the middle of the city, they don't hold the city. It's a city of 1.4 million people, and they are taking casualties, the Russians, and they're finding it very slow going.
We'll go back to what we know about actually what's happening on the ground in a moment. But first, you mentioned sanctions. Do you not think that President Putin will have factored in that there would have been sanctions, and that these sanctions would have been enormous, and that he actually doesn't care about Russia being a pariah state?
Well, I think, firstly, he probably looked at the sanctions the West put in place in 2014 and calculated with his large cash reserves that he would be able to survive that type of repeat. And while some of those sanctions, even from 2014, still exist, I think he probably planned on them being ratcheted up. I don't think he would have woken up earlier, a few days ago and realised and recognised that actually the SWIFT system did manage to kick Russia out and has taken a decision to sanction its central bank. I think that would have been way beyond the expectations of the Russian system. But I think, and on your last point, I think what we have to remember here is President Putin believed that these people would welcome him as a liberator. He was convinced in his own mind, in his own writings, that the Russians and the Ukrainians were the same peoples, and all they were waiting for is the great Tsars or the president of Russia to come and liberate them. And of course, when you make that assumption, you make all the decisions that we see playing out on our television screens, which is a sort of arrogant armed forces that has got bogged down, ill-prepared young junior soldiers because the officers just thought this was going to be much easier than it was. You see equipment in the wrong places, and I think that's why he is, carrying on as he does. But your very last bit about does he care? Well, he obviously doesn't really care. I mean, when I went to Russia myself, the Russian Ministry of Defense, they were very clear that Russian people could suffer greater than mine or greater than Europeans. We can't be harmed by sanctions. And I remember saying at one stage, I actually don't want Russian people to suffer any more than I want European and British people to suffer. That's my view. None of us should want that. But I think there's definitely a sense of pride that somehow Russian suffering equals Russian leadership, and I think he's about to be shocked because this is the 21st century and Russian people, just like European people, don't want to go through what they're about to go through.
In terms of what is happening on the ground, do you have any understanding or any information about why this convoy approaching Kiev appears to have stalled? Is it, do we think, logistical issues, fueling, for example, or, getting supplies to them? Or is it possibly a tactical thing to wait?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of what you above, effectively. That what we have seen is that they weren't properly, their tactics weren't correct. They were doing things, thought they were rather confident they would take many of these cities in a few hours rather than 6 days or longer. And when any army on the move takes longer to do things, your logistical supply chain is stretched. If you're given enough rations for 2 days and it takes you 6, you've suddenly got a problem. And I think what we've seen is a lot of those issues are coming to bear. They've also been surprised by the Ukrainian strength of the resistance. And indeed, as a result, the Ukrainians have been also carrying out a very clever plan. We've seen footage, we can't verify, but we've seen footage of, Ukrainians using UAVs to attack petrol, train convoys, to go after logistical lines. We've seen railway lines blown up. All the things that you and I, think about when it comes to resistance. So I think that is effectively coming home to roost. But it is also a switch in Russian tactics. I think the Russians have realised that the Ukrainians, by fighting, are costing them lots and lots of casualties, and the Russians have taken significant casualties, far more than they would have planned. And I think what they are therefore doing is trying to switch tactics. And what you're seeing now is those heavy bombardments at night. They'll try. They won't come into the cities as much. They will, I'm afraid, as we've seen tragically, by the looks of things, carpet bomb cities. Indiscriminately in some cases. They will fly their air at night rather than daytime, because what we've seen is they get shot down in the daytime, and they will slowly but surely try and surround the cities and then either bypass them or bombard them. And I think that is the brutality that I'm afraid we are witnessing, and it's going to get worse. I've warned before on your programme that is the Russian doctrine is to get harder and tougher and more indiscriminate. And that's why that tragic strike on obviously the cemetery in the centre of Kiev is exactly what we should expect more of.
Some people believe, you talk about carpet bomb and cluster munitions have been used, thermobaric weapons have been used. Are you confident that both have?
We will collect the evidence on a range of those usage. A number of international partners, such as Canada, are quite rightly putting lots of effort in collecting evidence. If there was any evidence of war crimes, that would be either presented to the International Criminal Court, or indeed countries on their own are free to take certain actions. We have to, war crimes or anything else are done based on evidence. We've seen reports. We've certainly seen the deployment of some of those weapon systems. We haven't verified the use, but that's what we will collect evidence for it. And, some of these weapon systems are horrendous. About a week ago, we summoned the defense attaché from the Russian embassy to the ministry to remind him of his obligations under the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention is there to uphold a humanitarian treatment of both prisoners of war but also of civilian populations. They have to live up to those obligations, and we will make sure that we hold them to account whatever happens, whether it's now or in years to come.
Boris Johnson was held to account personally yesterday by a Ukrainian journalist who wanted him to explain to her why Britain can't enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Why can't we?
Well, I've been on your programme about 4 times in the last week, and I've explained why. The reason is, I'm afraid, simple, but it is, very difficult to take that course. But it is the course we have to take, which is, if you have a no-fly zone, you have to enforce a no-fly zone. That would involve British fighter jets shooting down Russian fighter jets, probably over Ukraine. That would lead to Article 5 triggering of NATO, and NATO is a self-defence pact. All 30 countries will come to each other's aid. The triggering of that Article 5 would lead to a war against Russia across the whole of Europe. That is not a position that members of NATO are prepared to go. That is why, one of the reasons, Russia does not want countries to join NATO, because once they are in NATO, this self-defence mechanism is strong. It's why we're reinforcing and indeed reassuring our friends in places like the Baltic states who are in NATO but are on the edge of Russia. But that is the reality of it. And we can do the next best thing, and that's not a great comfort, I understand, to Ukraine, but we can arm them, we can support them, we can convene the international community to condemn Russia, to put in very large sanctions, to freeze their assets, to target the leaders of that country. And, whatever happens in Ukraine, and I hope Russia sees sense, I hope it realizes this is not a way forward, but whatever happens in Ukraine, the Russian government we see before us today on our television screens will be isolated. And, as I think as Diana said in Moscow, Russians were saying we don't want to be North Korea. But, if they're not careful, the long-term effect on the Russian government will be isolation.
But it seems to me, as I stand here on the Ukrainian border and watch these families coming across, I saw a family 3 generations coming across a short time ago, the grandmother in tears. You're reminding us all how Britain must play by the rules. But Putin isn't playing by the rules. How far does he have to go in breaking the rules before we take some kind of direct action?
Well, I think the question is, how far does Europe want us to get towards a war across Europe with Russia? How far does the British public want us to go against a nuclear-armed power who may view escalation of all means? So I think we have to be realistic here. Ukraine, and I've said it even before this conflict started, Britain was at the forefront of helping try and get Ukraine into NATO. It takes all 30 countries to support it. We've had troops in Ukraine through Operation Orbital since 2014, 2015, helping the Ukrainians train. We've trained 20,000 troops to get them up to standard to join NATO. We've done a lot of that, but others wanted to move at a different pace. So the reality is, on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine a week ago, Ukraine was not in NATO. So we have to do everything else in our power to do that. But I'm afraid I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to put at risk the rest of Europe by triggering a major, potentially, war across the whole continent.
Is the UK able to send planes to allow Ukrainians to enforce the no-fly zone themselves?
Well, look, there isn't a no-fly zone. So let's just be really clear here. And the other thing that no one seems to talk about in the no-fly zone is, who does the no-fly zone benefit? If you had a no-fly zone in Ukraine, the overwhelming scale of the Russian army would be able to drive around with impunity, which it can't at the moment. You talked about the armoured column, without any air attack from the Ukrainians, because there would be a no-fly zone. So it's a bit like in the Battle of Britain. If we said, "Oh, let's have a no-fly zone," if an unhelpful suggestion came around saying, "Let's have a no-fly zone," that would have suited the vast, German Wehrmacht army. It wouldn't have suited the small, the United Kingdom, who were just not previously just returned back from Dunkirk. Let's ask ourselves, what would it have achieved? You can still have fighting with a no-fly zone, it just won't be in the air. And that would allow those Russian armoured columns to drive around with impunity and not be struck from the air, where currently Ukrainian aircraft and Ukrainian unmanned air vehicles are causing damage on key parts of their logistical chain. So I think people who suggest a no-fly zone should be really clear what they're trying to achieve and how it would be enforced, because I don't see them actually coming up with any logical details behind it.
OK, Ben Wallace, Defence Secretary, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's see how the situation in Ukraine has developed in the last day. Late last night, at least 4 people were killed when a Russian airstrike hit a residential area in Zhytomyr, a city around 85 miles west of Kiev. In the second city, Kharkiv, a missile strike hit a regional administration building in the central Freedom Square yesterday morning. And in the last few minutes, Kharkiv's governor has said at least 21 people were killed and 112 wounded in that shelling. In the capital, Kiev, an airstrike on the city's main TV tower yesterday afternoon left at least 5 dead and took some Ukrainian channels off air briefly. President Zelensky's office said that the nearby Holocaust memorial, as we were talking about, was also damaged by a strike. Well, British intelligence suggests Russian forces are also encircling Kherson and Mariupol in the south. Mariupol's mayor says 128 people are currently in hospital following the attacks in the city. Kherson's mayor has said that Russian forces had captured the city's railway station and port last night. And overnight, Ukraine's defence ministry has claimed it has evidence that Belarus is preparing to send its troops into the country. Satellite images in recent days have shown Belarusian aircraft assembling near the border. Well, the humanitarian situation crisis continues to grow following Russia's invasion. Hundreds of thousands of people have already left Ukraine. The United States says that as of 1 p.m. yesterday, over 660,000 people fled Ukraine to neighbouring countries in the first 6 days of the conflict. Poland's Deputy Interior Minister says that this morning, over 450,000 people had entered from Ukraine in total. The UN has estimated that up to 4 million people could try to flee the country. And they are coming across this border here, across Chenko. They're being met by volunteers who have fires going. There's hot drinks, there's food for them coming to this border from inside Poland to ferry these people to refugee centres further inland. So that's what's happening on the Polish side of the border. Let's get the latest from inside Ukraine. Adam Parson joins us now from the western city of Lviv, which has been a focal point for the humanitarian crisis, with tens of thousands of people heading there before they then head on towards the border with Poland. And Adam, what is the situation there this morning?
The situation is busy and cold, frankly. That building you can see behind me, that very grand building, is Lviv's main railway station. So my team and I came into here yesterday afternoon from very near where you are on a train that was very quiet, about 60 people on it. When we got into that train station, quite curious actually, the platforms were deserted. Then you came down into the tunnels underneath and it was packed with women and children who were waiting to get on the train going out of here and back towards the Polish border. Women, children and some older people, some pensioners. I didn't see any young Ukrainian men trying to get onto that train. There were foreign nationals, students or migrant workers. The young Ukrainian men are staying here in Ukraine. They've been asked to stay and fight for their country, and that is what they are doing. So the people you see over there in the distance outside the train station are the ones who are here now trying to get out of the country or arriving. I think it is worth saying not everyone is trying to flee Ukraine and get into Poland. A lot of people who are arriving here in Lviv and then remaining here, they are displaced within their own country, arriving from, whether it's Kiev, trying to get to a safer city, which Lviv is at the moment. But then again, clearly there are lots trying to flee. The Polish border guard says 98,000 people crossed into Poland from Ukraine yesterday. They say the total, and this is just going to Poland, is now about 450,000. Let's paint you a little bit of a picture of what it's like here. It's cold, it's snowing, and if you look around here, you see people who have arrived with bags, with not many possessions, and they've arrived into a country, into an area, city that is cold but welcoming. The welcome comes in the form of food and drink, and frankly, safety. And there's a slightly heady sense to the air as well, because there's snow fluttering down on us. There's also over there, you can maybe able to see the smoke coming up. These are from the braziers, from the wood that is being burnt on these enormous charcoal ovens. And so you have that smell in the air as well. But all around us are people who need help. Come here with, I can see this lady here is looking cold and I have to say looking very, very anxious and scared. People don't have very much. They have gone away from their homes. They brought, in many cases, brought their pets with them. You see a lot of cats and dogs. Red Cross is operating here. I think it is worth also saying that in Lviv itself, this is a safe place. This is a long way from the front line at the moment, but there's still that sense of nervousness. To get here, we have had to come through roadblocks. We had 3 people came into our vehicle to check our credentials. One of them, a young man, very friendly man, but holding an AK-47 rifle. I don't think he was used to having that to him. We've seen an army recruitment centre with a line of people outside it already. There was an even bigger queue. We saw there yesterday. There are these kind of homemade anti-tank hedgehogs, enormous metal devices that are being put in place. So we're a long way from the fighting here, and yet the rumours always abound that the Belarusian troops could descend on this city. The bottom line is, this is where people are trying to get away from. Lviv has become every Ukrainian's plan B.
Adam, thanks very much. And that is their plan B, and then I suppose this is their plan C. This is where they come to when they've passed through Lviv. They're coming to border crossings like this, Kroschenko. As we've been talking to you, another family have come across the border. It's a really slow process. They're processing family groups individually. So about every sort of 5 minutes, another group come through. They're usually escorted by the border guards wearing those black outfits with the yellow marks on them. Then they try and link them up with somebody here on this side. Sometimes they've got people they know and they're being met by people and they're waiting here. There are cars parked further up the hill, but often it's just actual volunteers from Poland who've come down here to help take people to other parts of the country. They're taken from here onto other areas, onto central railway stations and refugee centres where they can stay overnight if they need to. Well, in the last few moments, we've heard from the Ukrainian president. He says that up so far, by day 6 of the conflict, 6,000 Russian troops, he believes, have been killed in this conflict, and he's renewed his bid for Ukraine to join the EU. Meanwhile, President Biden has used his State of the Union address to say that Russia is now more isolated from the world than ever. He said Vladimir Putin will pay a high price for invading Ukraine. Our US correspondent Mark Stone reports from Washington.
President Biden, has Vladimir Putin committed war crimes?
No comment from the American president as he left the White House for the short journey up Pennsylvania Avenue. They had gathered on Capitol Hill for the key annual moment in America's political diary. But the State of the Union this year required a broader focus.
Madam Speaker, the President of the United States.
With the yellow and the blue dotted through the chamber, he pitted autocracy against democracy, good against evil.
6 days ago, Russia's Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. But he badly miscalculated. He thought he could roll into Ukraine and the world would roll over. Instead, he met with a wall of strength he never anticipated or imagined. He met the Ukrainian people.
In the audience, the guest of honor.
The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States is here tonight, sitting with the First Lady. Let each of us, if you're able to stand and send an unmistakable signal to the world of Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Unity among nations was the key theme.
In the battle between democracy and autocracies, democracies are rising to the moment, and the world is clearly choosing the side of peace and security.
There was this message for those who surround Putin.
Tonight, I say to the Russian oligarchs and the corrupt leaders who bilked billions of dollars off this violent regime, no more. The United States, I mean it.
And as he has so many times, he said again, America would not fight in Ukraine, would not fight Russia, but would defend freedom however it can.
It matters. American diplomacy matters. American resolve matters.
But at a time when American and Western resolve is facing its greatest challenge in decades, there were no standout soundbites, no George Bush axis of evil moments. No, this was measured, calm, focused, and yet it couldn't provide any hints of how all this might develop, how it might end.
As he left, the president had a message of support for his top general.
Besides, we've got the best damn generals in the world.
A man whose counsel he values and may need in the weeks ahead. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Well, while the diplomacy and the statements come from world leaders, of course, the fighting is still going on inside Ukraine, where many, many millions of people still are. Alex Rossi joins us now from inside, from Dnipro. What is the situation where you are?
Well, at the moment, it's extremely tense. It's calm inside the city of Dnipro. This is an arterial city which links east and west, so it would be a key strategic target for the Russians. The assumption really is that they will push up from the south and in from the east once they've taken the areas there. Now, in terms of the Russian fighting along the coastline with the Sea of Azov, Ukraine has pretty much now been cut off from that coastal area. Mariupol, another key city, is, from what I understand, pretty much surrounded now by Russian forces. There's been fairly heavy bombardment, shelling inside the city in residential areas. The situation there is pretty desperate, as it is in Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv, which again has faced a pretty heavy pounding overnight. There have also been reports from the Ukrainian authorities that Russian paratroopers arrived at about 3 a.m. and there were significant and very prolonged clashes in the city. And of course, that place is also being hit hard by shelling as well. The fear is in all of these areas that Russia, perhaps frustrated by the problems that it has had so far in this invasion, is now really upping the violence. As far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they are accusing the Russians, and there is plenty of evidence of that as well, which we can independently verify, that they are attacking civilian areas with the intent of terrorizing the population, and that appears also to be working. We are seeing very large numbers of people now fleeing the country. The United Nations says something like 660,000 people have now fled. Train stations are crowded. People are squeezing on to whatever transport they can get on so that they can get out of the country. But that's not to say that the resistance against the Russian invasion remains as fierce as ever. All over this city, and it's something that's replicated across Ukraine, they are digging in for a prolonged and sustained fight. They will keep resisting the Russians and try to repel those forces for as long as they can. Effectively, what you have here, and this perhaps is a reflection of why it is so very desperate, is this is an existential fight, really, for the soul of Ukraine as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. They talk about freedom, they talk about democracy, they don't want the cloak of darkness of the Kremlin descending across their country, and they are going to pay for that in blood and sweat. They say they will continue fighting for as long as they can.
Alex, thanks very much for that. Well, a short while ago, I spoke to the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and he told me that Russia's apparent slow progress may in part be down to the assumption of Vladimir Putin that his troops would have been welcomed by Ukrainians and that the invasion would not have been met with such strong resistance.
What we have to remember here is President Putin believed that these people would welcome him as a liberator. He was convinced in his own mind, in his own writings, that the Russians and the Ukrainians were the same peoples, and all they were waiting for is the great Tsars or the president of Russia to come and liberate them. And of course, when you make that assumption, you make all the decisions that we see playing out on our television screens, which is a sort of arrogant armed forces that has got bogged down, ill-prepared young junior soldiers because the officers just thought this was going to be much easier than it was. You see equipment in the wrong places, and I think that's why he is, carrying on as he does.
Well, it's getting really busy down here now on the border this morning. A bit of a change of troops, as it were, in terms of staffing here, and also quite a lot of lorries bringing supplies, etc., down here. Let's talk to Tamara Cohen now, who joins us now from Westminster. In terms of the politics, Tamara, we've got Prime Minister's questions today, of course. What pressure do you think will be brought upon the Prime Minister about the current situation?
Morning, Jane. Well, I think what's not going to be the subject of pressure on the Prime Minister really is to introduce a no-fly zone. There aren't significant calls from Conservative or Labour MPs to do that for the reasons that Ben Wallace set out very bluntly there, perhaps more bluntly than the Prime Minister did yesterday, that it risks simply a nuclear war because Russia is a nuclear-armed country and, as Ben Wallace put it, they may escalate this conflict by any means if NATO forces go out trying to enforce such a no-fly zone. And he also says that those who are advocating it have not thought through the fact that it may actually disadvantage the Ukrainians militarily and benefit the Russians. So very firmly slapping down that idea. The help that we're going to be offering to the Ukrainians, he made very clear, is sanctions. And he said that these sanctions are above and beyond what Vladimir Putin will have factored into his calculations, really biting on ordinary Russians. And of course, sending military aid, as we have done already and may be doing at the moment, to the Ukrainians to try and fight the Russians. He talked about the role of morale and the fact that the Ukrainian resistance has been so fierce is perhaps the reason why this convoy of tanks that we can see in those satellite pictures making its way towards Kiev has made such slow progress. He says the Russians may be in process of changing their strategy to bombarding cities. That's going to be terrible news for all those Ukrainians holed up in cities, that this may be a very long war. There may be a very long resistance to be fought there. But he was very clear that the military aid that NATO will be providing is at its full extent at the moment. I think the questions the Prime Minister will face today are about refugees and whether the government will allow in any more. They announced yesterday that extended family of Ukrainians living in the UK would be allowed to apply to come here, but nothing at the moment for Ukrainians who don't have ties here. And there may be also calls from Labour for those sanctions to be sped up.
OK, Tamara, thanks very much. As we've been talking to Tamara, another family have just come through and been processed and got into a private car to go back into Poland. Let's get some more reaction, though, from another country in Eastern Europe. Let's talk to the Prime Minister of Kosovo, Albin Kurti. Really good to talk to you today, sir. Thanks a lot for joining us on Sky News. How concerned are you that the events that are happening in Ukraine could spill over into the Balkans, possibly into your country?
Good morning. Well, I think that we've already seen this in the Balkans, in Kosovo in spring 1999, when 860,000 Albanians from Kosovo were deported to Albania, Montenegro and North Macedonia. Hundreds of massacres took place. 12,000 civilians have been killed, unarmed civilians, and at the same time 20,000 women have been raped. We see now this Russian invasion, military aggression, that every institutional leader, every European and world politician should condemn fiercely, clearly. And in this way, we should all show solidarity and admiration with the courage and liberation struggle of Ukrainian people. Balkans is not immune from the effects of the situation in Ukraine, because in the Balkans we have a country which did not impose sanctions on Russian Federation, which did not join EU into condemning Russian invasion, and that is Serbia, our first neighbor. We have a very long border with Serbia. Serbia is our northern neighbor who does not recognize Republic of Kosovo, in contrast to Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. They have very strong ties, and these ties are both cultural and historical on one hand, but also military and economic ones. For example, Serbia has 14 MiG-29, and these fighter jets, and they've gotten 8 of them as donation from Belarus and 6 from Russian Federation. In Serbian parliament, out of 250 MPs, 151 of them are members of the Russian-Serbian Friendship Group. It is the largest friendship group. And at the same time, Gazprom, Russian Gazprom, owns 56% of oil industry in Serbia and 51% of gas storage in Banatski Dvor in Vojvodina, which is the biggest one in southern Eastern Europe. Lukoil, Sberbank, all Russian companies have their branches in Serbia, and that's why people of Kosovo are worried that despotic president of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, will try to outsource war also in the Western Balkans by turning it into his battleground with Western democracies. But we stand firm and vigilant, and we are not afraid. We want to join EU and NATO. Currently, we have NATO in Kosovo, but sooner we get NATO membership, it will be better for people of Kosovo, for Republic of Kosovo, but for the entire region and European continent in general.
And Kosovo has already been mentioned, hasn't it, by the Russian foreign minister a few times. He said that people from Kosovo had gone to fight in Donbass. What do you make of that?
That shows his intention. He wants to destabilize the Balkans. That's why he's saying these false things. There are no Kosovar citizens who went to fight in Donbass. It is Russia which annexed Donbass and Crimea. Let us not forget that President Putin came to power as Prime Minister of Russian Federation only 2 months after liberation of Kosovo in 1999. And then he annexed South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia in the same year, few months after we declared our independence on 17th of February 2008. President Putin was mentioning Kosovo at least once a month, and now he's doing it every week because he simply hates NATO, hates the West. He is a despotic leader who is both bitter and nostalgic, and he would like to turn hybrid war into war. Now we have seen that hybrid war was never a substitution for war. It was just its preparatory phase. And there is hybrid war also in the Western Balkans. And Sputnik Center is in Belgrade for the entire region of Western Balkans. That's why EU and NATO should engage more with the Western Balkans. I urge 5 non-recognizers within EU to recognize Republic of Kosovo. Spain, Slovakia, Romania, Greece, and Cyprus should recognize independence of Kosovo, and in this way contribute a great deal to peace, stability, and security. On the other hand, President Putin was hosting at Sochi last November President of Serbia, Vučić, who during the meeting showed map of Kosovo with northern part in particular, because some of the illegal structures of Serbia are still very active and functioning there. Basically, they are in close coordination. That's why EU capitals should be very firm in asking from Belgrade to condemn Russian invasion and military aggression, because Ukraine has not been overrun by earthquake or floods. It was not a natural disaster. It was war machinery led by a despotic president with a genocidal intent, which is causing a mass expulsion of Ukrainians from Ukraine. Apparently, Russian blitzkrieg has failed, but it is obvious for me that they will go now after a partition, after dividing Ukraine into eastern and western part, where the western part they will try to be landlocked and as small territorially as possible. That's why I support people of Ukraine. We have imposed sanctions on Russian Federation, just like Council of EU decided. And at the same time, we are going to host 20 journalists from Ukraine who had to flee their country. Last Sunday, the decision of Bundestag was historic. And that was of a great help for EU and for the region.
OK, we must leave it there. The Prime Minister of Kosovo, Albin Kurti, really good to talk to you today. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's just bring you some new images that we have. Sky News has verified the video of a missile strike in Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. Well, the attack caused damage to a university and government building, which are opposite one another. The two buildings are in the centre of Kharkiv, with this strike, of course, following yesterday's attack on the city's Freedom Square. Well, in his first State of the Union address, the US President Joe Biden last night vowed that Vladimir Putin would not divide the West. But how has the US response to the crisis been received? Well, national security analyst and attorney Ari Aramesh joins me now from West London. Ari, good to talk to you today. What did you make of Biden's comments last night, talking about a closure of US airspace to Russian planes? Is it going to make any difference to President Putin, do you think?
Well, it's going to increase the pressure. It's important to pressure President Putin both militarily, economically, and also physically. Now, Russian airspace, or at least Russian airplanes and equipment and aircraft, have now become unwelcome in many European capitals and now in the United States. And it's not just oligarchs. It's not just military sort of exchanges, but the most important thing is these civilian aircrafts are no longer welcome to come to the United States. Now, that sends a message to the Russian people that the actions of President Putin has made and has turned Russia into a pariah. For years and years, Putin's clients, like Khamenei of Iran or Assad of Syria, they were the pariahs, but they were clients of Moscow. And now you see that President Putin and his inner circle are now turning Russia into one of those international pariahs that ironically have also brought such a spirit of unity to the Western world and to the free world. Last night, watching President Biden's State of the Union address, you could not have seen bipartisan standing ovation for President Biden just a couple weeks ago. But every time he mentioned Ukraine, every time he talked about the Ukrainian people's solidarity, Ukrainian people's strong will to defend themselves and to fight for their destiny, and also American support for Ukrainians, for NATO, for the Western Alliance, and for the free world, you saw bipartisan standing ovation and long-standing ovations for that matter. So, yes, Putin has miscalculated. He has failed, and now he's paying the price. But here's the thing. I don't think Putin is going to just roll back his incursion because we're imposing sanctions. Sanctions are a punishment, but they are a long-term punishment. Right now, what the Ukrainians need the most, especially coming from those NATO borders, from Hungary, from Slovakia, from Romania, and from Poland, are arms, lethal defensive measures to be able to take out Russian armor and Russian mechanized units and Russian infantry. The Javelin missiles, Stingers to take out and neutralize Russian air superiority. So yes, that we should continue helping the Ukrainian people with aid. We should continue helping the Ukrainian government both rhetorically, but also finance this war effort and sent what they need. And that is arms, and that is especially armor-busting javelins. That is exactly the sort of equipment they need, and we should provide it. Now, again, even if major cities were to fall, even if Kyiv or Kharkiv or Mariupol in the east, Odessa in the south, even if they were to fall, you could still have an insurgency on your hand, and that could still exert much cost and much pressure on Putin and on a Russian sort of occupying force in Ukraine. So helping out the Ukrainian resistance, Ukrainian military, and the Ukrainian people in this phase, even if major cities were to fall, still not futile. It's a long-term investment in this fight.
Arash Aramesh, national security analyst and attorney. Good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Well, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought about a raft of changes to global flight patterns, of course. Let's talk now to Ryanair Chief Executive Michael O'Leary. Mr. O'Leary, in terms of flights to this part of the world, what has the impact been? Obviously, you're not able to fly into Ukraine anymore, but has there been a knock-on impact on other areas around here?
Not really, Jane. We were Ukraine's largest airline. We flew to the 4 airports in Ukraine up until last Thursday morning: Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa and Lviv. We carry about 2 million passengers a year to and from the Ukraine. But all those aircraft are based in Poland, in Romania, in Italy and in Germany. So, regrettably, while we'd like to continue to serve the Ukraine, the skies are closed, which is right, I think, for safety reasons. We'll pivot those aircraft and operate more flights from Poland, Romania, Italy and Germany to the beaches of Greece, Italy, Spain and Portugal this summer. Much as we have seen, obviously, a huge increase in demand for our flights to and from those Polish cities where many Ukrainians are now travelling back to the UK and to other cities where they have relatives across Europe. Our flights from Rzeszów, Krakow, Warsaw, and we're very happy to play a very small role in reuniting those Ukrainian families across Europe.
How quickly could you turn things around if the situation changed and it became safer in Ukraine? How quickly could you get planes back in there?
We'd have planes back in there, I think, within about 4 weeks. But the challenge is how much the airports have been degraded. Last Thursday night, our understanding was that the Russians took out the radar facilities, the ILS and the radars at the main Ukrainian airports, which is why the European authorities said close the skies. It wasn't safe to fly there. But subject, and I think, there'd be a huge willingness from Western authorities to rebuild those radars, to put the facilities back in, particularly for the summer. And I guarantee you, Ryanair will be the first airline and first aircraft back into Ukraine as soon as it opens. We value our business in Ukraine. As I said, we have 2 million Ukrainian customers flying with us every year, and we will restore that business as soon as it is safe to do so and as soon as we're permitted to do so safely.
And what about, of course, the knock-on impact we've seen on fuel prices generally across the world? What impact is that having on the airline industry? And presumably those increases are going to be passed on to passengers.
I think it's going to be very difficult for most airlines for the next 12 months. I mean, last Thursday we saw spot oil prices rise from 75 to over $100 a barrel. Thankfully, or luckily, Ryanair, we're 80% hedged. We've hedged out about 80% of our fuel needs out to March 2023. So for this summer and for the rest of this year, we'll still be able to pass on low oil prices and low fares to our customers because we have a very strong fuel hedging position. Up until last Thursday, we were hedging into the summer of 2023. We've about 9% of our fuel needs bought forward at about $75 a barrel. But those prices have now, over the last 5 days, rocketed to $95 a barrel. And I'm not sure, we would still believe, hopefully, that the Ukrainian situation will be resolved in favour of Ukraine in the near to short term. But there's no doubt that if oil prices remain high at around $100 a barrel, we are going to see a dramatic increase in supply. The Iranians are talking to the Americans about resolving the nuclear discussions. They're already loading up tankers to export oil. The US shale producers, we believe, will start turning on production. And I think the most important thing we in the West can do is drive up oil production, because what hits Russia hardest is low oil prices and low gas prices. So we should, as well as sanctioning the Russians, do everything we can to increase oil and natural gas supplies around the world, drive down oil prices, because that's what hits the Russian authorities hardest, is low oil prices.
OK. Michael O'Leary, good to talk to you this morning. Thanks a lot for joining us on Sky. Well, you're watching Sky News live from the Polish-Ukrainian border this morning. We're at Kroschenko. This is one of the places that those wanting to leave Ukraine are coming to. They're arriving at the border on the other side, some on foot. The majority are being dropped off by car. We are seeing some cars come through, not so many, but the ones that do come through are absolutely full to the gunnels of people. They are really, really chock full, as many people as possible getting across in cars. We're also seeing a lot of families coming across on foot, mums and children being met by people here on the Polish side of the border.